Good morning. This is Joyce at Delightful Quilting and Sewing, a Knowlton dealer in Avon, New York. The Tech Tuesday this week, which really isn't Tuesday, it's Wednesday because I had cataract surgery 2 days ago. We're looking at a very, very old quilt here that goes way back into at least the mid 1800s. The story behind this quilt is it belongs to my husband's sister's husband and was passed down in their family. And it was, the story is that it came from England and was made perhaps in the earlier 1800s and was passed along, and at one point it came to America. But it had to go to one of two brothers here in America that had come to America because one brother was more reliable than the other one, and they wanted to make sure that the quilt would be preserved. So it was kept in this family, and back last year, the aunt of my brother-in-law passed away. She was over 100 years old, and they have this quilt, which they did know the story about. So I have a friend, her name is Beth Davis, and she is local here in New York. She is a certified quilt appraiser, certified quilt historian, even wrote a book called, what was it?
Stitch in Time.
Stitch in Time with Genesee Valley.
Genesee Country Village Museum's collection.
Yep. Here in New York State, not far from where I'm at. So I invited her to come over and give me her impressions of this quilt. My sister-in-law and brother-in-law brought it up a few weeks ago, and I knew Beth would be excited to see it, and she was more than excited to see it because she saw pictures of it before, which did not do justice to it. So,
no.
Beth, you can share your impressions of this.
Well, what I see in this quilt, it's beautiful condition. It is just with some slight aging, but the fabrics are in great condition, so it's obviously been taken care of. And the skill of the quilt maker who made them is just so apparent when you get to actually see this in person. The stitches are very fine, and it's very strong. It's just in beautiful condition for something that is so old. But the quilt maker, you when you see this kind of a quilt, it's so exciting. You kind of wonder what she was like. She obviously had a large amount of fabric or access. A lot of times we like to say people that have these scrappy quilts like this may have been connected with the local dry goods store, or maybe somebody in the family was a dressmaker and had a lot of scraps. But the oldest fabric that I see in this was this ring of the flower right here, the hexagon, and it's a chintz. It would have been block printed, so a printer would have carved out of, usually there's wood, and then they also can line it with some sort of metal to get these fine designs, but it was printed like several times. You see, bits and pieces of flowers and leaves. So that one is probably one of the earliest. And then as you see some of the other fabrics, you see a lot of early 1800s technology with, roller printed, it's, there's just such a vast amount of technology that was in this quilt alone. The madder dyes, this would have been, it was all natural dyes at the time. So, and it was how they treated the dyes that you could get a really wide variety of colors from just one plant, a madder root. You would get, these what you typically see is, you know, this brown, rusty brown colors, but you could also get purple, and it was a fugitive purple, so you can see there's a little bit of, slight bit of fading as the color disappears. It would have been much brighter back in the day when the quilt maker made it. But these were also matter prints, but they would add different products to it to get a darker color. But you see a lot of what you call shirting prints, these white prints basically. They were cheaper to make because there wasn't a lot of dye involved, and typically the woman's shirt would be made out of these colors and her skirt would be a different, darker print. But you also see more of a, this kind of a Prussian blue, and as you go out you will see there's even like this wonderful indigo with cheddar. It's just beautiful. And a lot of the blocks, if you see, when you look out from the center mosaic, where she made the flowers, she did a lot of fussy cutting, which is just phenomenal. I mean, she did everything from centering her stripes and, just some of the indigo, she just, fussy cut all these flowers. And when you look all the way to the edge, I mean, she even went to the detail of cutting partial hexagons to fill out that hexagon shape, so she had a flat edge. And then she turned the edges in, which is typical for the mid-1800s, so there's no binding. And then there's a back.
And also no batting.
And no batting. It's a summer weight. It's just very lightly quilted, basically just holding it to the foundation. So it's just a plain muslin foundation. And again, the condition is just phenomenal with so little what we call boxing, where you see these kind of brown stains, and the edges are just, in phenomenal shape. It was really never used. Because typically on quilts of this age, if it was used on a bed, and this would have been a very large bed, you would see, some usage, or, where the fabric has been pulled and, up to the chin. Sometimes they use chin guards to protect the edges, but this has not even ever been used. Then just the very little bit of boxing on the back.
So the pattern that is in this, it would be, what would you call this?
It would call it a mosaic. Very typical of quilts you see made in the UK back in the mid-1800s. It later became, when it came to the US, and people were making mosaic quilts in the US in that time period, but then it also came into where people were making more of the concentrating on the flower shapes, and it became what we lovingly know as grandmother's flower gardens. But back in the mid-1800s, that was not really much of a thing. It was more these mosaic where you start in the center and you work your way out. And it's kind of neat where you see where she did rings of color until she got to this point, and then she just kind of went a little crazy and did more of a scrappy thing with a few little flowers here and there. It's just, we don't know if it was a generational quilt. The stitches all look, pretty consistent. Slight variations, but not enough to make you think that it was a generational quilt. But the way that it started out and then kind of stopped on this ring and then became this little slightly different kind of crazy looking mosaic kind of makes you think it could have been a generational thing. Maybe great grandma started the center, and then, by the time she got too old and not able to do it, maybe somebody else picked it up. It's hard to say, but the stitches were consistent and just beautifully done. Just beautifully done.
So you mentioned about storing it. And
yes.
Your basic recommendation for
My-
that is?
Basic recommendation, and this is what we do at the museums. A couple local museums in Rochester I've worked with taking their quilts out and storing them in a more consistent way. And a lot of times we use like an acid-free box. And then it used to be that we would use acid-free tissue paper, but we find that the way tissue paper is made, it becomes acidic very quickly, and that would actually damage the quilt. The acid could leach into the cotton fibers and cause problems. So we tend to be more where we make what we call pool noodles. They're not really, the pool noodles you buy at Walmart, but we make our own out of stockinette and batting, so that when you fold the quilt to put it into the box, that the folds are very gentle and will not cause creases. I mean, the fabric is very supple, it's not brittle, but you still need to be concerned that, storing it for a very long length of time, that the folds need to be rounded out so that there's no creases in the fabrics. So that's what we tend to do at most of the major museums we have in Rochester. So, and elsewhere. I mean, some places, if they're big enough, they can lay the quilt out on a bed, which would, be the less stress on a quilt of this age. But that's just not feasible in most people's homes. And we always like to say that these quilts, you want to store them like you would your favorite person in your family, elderly person. You don't want to put them in the attic. You don't want to put them in the basement. You want it to live in the same space that you enjoy living in, so that it's not too hot or too cold or getting too much moisture. So.
Great. Well, thank you, Beth. I appreciate your great input on this, your insight, because like you, when I first saw this, when Nancy and
It takes your breath
brought
away.
it, yeah, when
It
Nancy
really
and Lenny
does.
brought it to me, it did. The pictures that just did not do justice to how beautiful this is, and the fact that they know the history of it is even more, especially with a quilt going back as far as it does.
Yeah.
To have that history.
Actually, it's wonderful that the family wants to keep it in the family, which is just a phenomenal thing. I mean, antique quilts are very difficult for families to take care of. I mean, you have to do a little extra care for them, but so worth it when they get to keep a little bit of history in their family.
So thank you, Beth, so much for coming over today and filling us in on this beautiful quilt.